Hello, my name is Renata Zablotny, and this is my narrative project for Oltd 512. I'd like to first start off with my impressions of Thomas King. Now, I am fairly familiar with King's work and theater productions, and he himself has described himself as a postmodern writer. Now, I would like to give my own interpretation of what, or really a paraphrase of what postmodernist writing offers. To paraphrase, I believe that postmodernist storytelling is non-escapism, or really at its core, it's trying to not be escapism. It's really trying to present itself as truth and honesty, and many of the themes of this look like examining oppression or past oppression and exposing an ugly side of society. A lot of these themes deal in LGBTQ conflict, racial prejudice, and women's rights. A formula of seeing wrong and injustice, curing the wrong, or exposing the wrong. This presents what I believe to be a very deterministic view of man. To give you this formula in real simplistic terms, man does wrong. Wrong will be done. Man will be defeated by his own wrong. Now that may seem kind of facetious or a rather glib view, but I'm going to back that up with an example from one of my favorite postmodern writers, who unfortunately is an escapist writer, but Michael Crichton, who of course wrote Jurassic Park. Now the formula goes for Jurassic Park, something like this, but very similar.
God creates dinosaurs. God destroys dinosaurs. God creates man. Man destroys God. Man creates dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs eat man. Woman inherits the earth.
That last part is just a joke for the last part. But again, it follows that kind of formula very much in that deterministic way that we will be undone by our own choices, or we are prisoners to our predetermined bad choices. And I like this example because it is very clearly relating to Damien Nismagolo's technology equilibrium. Now that dictates that to every positive effect man brings, that mankind brings, there will undoubtedly be a negative. So for instance, vaccines that nearly wipe out diseases, but then we will gain stronger diseases. We have a world where there is an abundance of food, yet we will have more diabetes and heart disease when we didn't have a lot of food, like say 100 years ago. We have the power to make dinosaurs, and then they eat us. So exactly, it continues to go on to this this constant equilibrium of whenever we bring something good to the table, there is also a negative to that. So it's looking at both of those sides in a very interesting way. So again, we are seeing this theme even appear in escapist postmodern writing, because I think it truly speaks to the pursuit of what feels like truth. And I'm saying what feels like truth because I am one who believes that truth is very objective. Okay, so here's what where I'm going to get a little unpopular, because of course I'm saying that truth is objective, but I really also have to argue with our esteemed Professor Melanie, that said that studying narratives as a source of knowledge and data has only recently enjoyed a renaissance. Well, I'd have to very much disagree. Like, through my education career, the idea that truth can be found in stories goes back for centuries and has been explored for centuries. And I think this is something that we have done for forever. Like, if you even go back to the Bible, that was how society structured much of its moral foundation on. Morality tales like Homer and the Iliad, which provided us a metaphor for our journey through life, and Plato and the allegory of the cave allowed us to see how we might be misinterpreting things. All of that provided a very strong sense of truth while also displaying itself as a narrative, as a make-believe story, an escapist story. We've always seen truth and learned deeply from, we've always seen this truth and we've learned deeply from these stories. I would also argue that perhaps the new Renaissance is that of non-escapist stories. Stories with true individuals or bibliographies or people that have encountered some heroic adventure, but some heroic true adventure, the martyrs of our modern time. Perhaps that is the new Renaissance is speaking towards non-escapism. One of the things that I struggle with postmodernist writing is the heroes, or really what I would call the anti-heroes. I'll use this example of my favorite anti-hero, Sherlock Holmes. Now, Sherlock Holmes is a postmodernist poster boy. He is highly intelligent, scientific. He doesn't fit in amongst normal society, to quote unquote normal society. In fact, he scoffs what is considered normality. He scoffs normality, he scoffs society, and dismisses its validity. And of course, what drives his purpose are the evil deeds of men. He's not shocked or emotionally binded by crime of murder, but instead he gets an exciting lure of the chase, and he sinks his teeth into another mystery to solve. His heroism depends on the evil of others. So we are so entertained and fascinated with the logical, controlled mind of Holmes that it is not that we relate to him, because of course he's kind of almost this unattainable, emotionless, like robot who is pure genius. So it's not that we can really relate to him, but we mimic or say even admire his nihilism and his lack of compassion or lack of empathy or lack of emotion inspired by his character. He is a modern hero whom we adore and society rejects. Another maybe not so popular character, which I doubt is postmodern, but I believe this character predicts the postmodern movement, is Gregor Samsa in Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Now, if you're not familiar with The Metamorphosis by Kafka, the main character, Gregor Samsa, or as the first paragraph goes, Gregor Samsa awoke one morning to find he'd been transformed into a giant cockroach. So his family grows to despise him because of his new metamorphosis, how he has grown from a man or a young boy now into a cockroach. He's rejected by his family and by his community. And he grows hideous, and the more he grows hideous and the more he is rejected, the more we as the reader become more compassionate towards this monster. I think that this is actually a genius. This is the genius behind Kafka, because he has allowed us to experience the pain and prejudice of a cockroach. We can recognize it as our own pain and our own story. And I know I've given you a yo-yo of examples of my experiences with postmodern writing. But again, an issue that I'll find with this is really how deep it can allow me to go. So I'll give you an example. In the great modern works of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, I'm asked to look through the lens of a poor, unfortunate Raskolnikov, who believes all of his issues will be solved if he just kill the crooked, cruel, rich old lady, rob her, become rich, and he will have righted himself, and he will set the world back on the straight and narrow. He'll set it back. He will equal out the world by relinquishing someone who is bad, and he who is good will right the wrong, will take over, and he who is poor will now be rich, and it will balance itself out. But instead we learn that Raskolnikov's choice was not that simple, and instead he does commit the crime, but what we encounter instead is we experience a painful and very real journey of guilt and regret. And we experience that with him. And although the main theme is there, that we can see what is not equal in this situation, and we can go and right this wrong, it still does not take him away from his humanity. And that's a powerful human emotion with no easy answers. And what I crave in a good narrative is choice, not determined by my past or who I am, but what I can achieve and overcome. Be that guilt and regret, which I know is a theme that maybe a lot of stories don't deal with, but that's something that I think is so raw and so real, and one that my story, I believe, deals with at the same time. And yes, I understand that the oppressed gives light to our own injustice, or even better, the injustice we have fallen onto others. But what I really seek is maybe not this maybe sounds very unpopular, but maybe not the truth, but tools to overcome and conquer the hardships and gain better understandings from who I may consider to be my enemy. The story I'm going to recall to you today is one I'm sure many of you have in your own family history. It is the story of my grandmother during World War II. Now, I had a very unique view growing up because my mother is Polish and my father is Russian German. So I got to experience the tale of the wars from all three sides. And one of the stories I was most impacted by was one that probably many would not think is one that you could relate to, because it is told not only from the perspective of a German, but a member of Hitler's Luftwaffe. Now, when I found out what a Nazi was, I was still quite young. And of course, this was me growing up and spending a lot of time in Poland with my mother's family. And I was able to really see and experience some of those horrors that many would only experience in textbooks. And then, of course, to my shock, I was learning that my Oma, grandmother, was not only a German, but had actually worked as a weather girl for the Luftwaffe and had seen Hitler on 2 occasions, which I was just beyond shocked over. When I asked her what was it like to meet Adolf Hitler, she actually had, to my surprise, she had no negative things to say about him. She said he was a very charming man, quite handsome, in her opinion. And I thought that was very interesting. Obviously, there was a certain amount of buy-in to her with Nazi propaganda and with the Nazi leadership, and the way she kind of described it, which I can understand in a lot of ways, is that she was very young when
It was the end of World War II, and she was born into a very devastated Germany. Her parents were very, very proud Germans, and they owed a ton of reparations. It wasn't as thriving, like, booming economy. It was not a ton of opportunities, and then here comes this very charismatic young man, and it provided a lot of hope. And she did kind of talk about how a lot of people in central Germany, when Hitler was first kind of coming around, they really didn't respond to him too well. And because she was from Wrocław, she had a very strong connection to this. Like, some of the rural towns actually really helped kind of get him into power. So she bought in. She was a Nazi. So of course, the Nazis there was a lot of secrecy among the Nazis. They did not disclose a lot of their plans to people. So they didn't know. She has told me on multiple occasions with tear in her eyes, they didn't know. They didn't know what was happening to the Jews. They didn't know what was happening to their own people. They didn't know about the camps. And I very much believe her and have seen a lot of history and evidence in history to back that up. So it's hard to look at this story from the first perspective of how I'm painting her, and to see that she's going to be the heroine of the story that I'm about to tell you. Because she's a Nazi. How could we sympathize with a Nazi? How can a Nazi relate to us? But the fact is that she was a German woman first. So my grandmother, my Oma, Bridget, she was living in Wrocław, and that's where her main command post of the Luftwaffe was. And the Russian army was entering the area. All communications, because of course my Oma, being the weather girl, she had main connection with the radio, and the radio actually went down. So all communication ceased in Wrocław. It's now Bratislava now. It's no longer Wrocław, but Bratislava. It's now part of Poland. But all communication went down. And when all communication went down, you could actually hear in the distance the sound of fire and artillery. Now, there was no way to know who was firing what, if it was the Russians, if it was the Germans. But the only thing that she knew for sure was that this noise was getting closer. So she was quite anxious, and when she was anxious, she would pace around, and she left her house and kind of went for a walk. And when she was coming back, she noticed her neighbor was packing their car and they were leaving. And she made the split decision that she was going to leave too. And she grabbed her 3-year-old daughter and she jumped in the back seat of their car. They were about 10 minutes outside of town, and they were following a convoy of cars, and they were maybe 11th in the convoy. There was quite a few cars, and it was all people kind of with their stuff, just kind of taking like their linens, their clothes, kind of things to get by, some food. It was all elderly people, women, children. They were unarmed. And they could hear this sound, and it was a very narrow road, and so they all had kind of that one direction that they just had to go down. And as they looked into the horizon, they saw a Russian patrol plane, and it started getting lower and lower and lower, and so low that when it got to the first car of the convoy, it started to machine gun the cars in a row, in the straight row. And the cars had nowhere they could go. They couldn't, they were so tight together, they couldn't really veer off into the ditch. So the neighbors and my Oma, they opened the car doors and they tucked and they rolled outside with my Oma and her 3-year-old daughter in her arms. And they rolled into the ditch while the car was still moving and crashed into the car next to them. A few people survived, but my Oma could just so clearly see. And she said just so how clearly she could see. As she looked up at the plane, she could see the pilot's face as he came and he mowed down all those cars. Everything was shot up. The cars were completely useless. Many, many, many were dead. Many elderly, children, mothers. She survived. I failed to mention that this was February. I don't know if you've ever been to Germany in February. It's quite cold. And she was not planning to take a road trip, so she was very ill prepared. She had her house clothes on, some shoes, some walking shoes, so not even boots on, and her jacket, or her coat, and then her daughter in her coat. They waited for a few hours, and then they saw a Russian patrol officer driving up the road, kind of getting the cars out of the way. She went up to the Russian patrol officer, and she said she was Dutch. She didn't want to give away that she was German. And she said, I'm Dutch, I'm from Holland, I'm trying to get home to Holland. And she tells me the story as she said they didn't care. They were very prepared. They were to kill them. They were very prepared that they could have just gone there and done whatever they like. But the fact was that they didn't do anything. But the Russian patrol officer, but the Russian patrol officer did offer her this piece of advice. He told her that the Russian army was 4 hours behind him. And if they did not get out of there now, they would come here and they would kill and rape everybody who was here. Well, that's all my Oma needed to hear, and she grabbed my aunt, and she put her in her arms, and she carried her for 4 days across the German terrain. My Oma had such bad frostbite on her feet. Her toes were literally mangled as an elderly woman, I remember. And it was because of these 4 days that she spent. She didn't have proper boots, and she suffered probably unimaginable pain. I've imagined wearing like uncomfortable shoes before, and how debilitating it is. And she walked for 4 days with no food, no water. They obviously had, and she walked for 4 days with very little food, water from the snow. They had very little, and she marched on in sore feet for 4 days until finally they got to a train station. Now, my Oma is incredibly persuasive. It was a German station, and it was filled with army patrol, and they were loading up wounded soldiers. And she insisted, and she followed them around for 4 hours. Many of the people who started with her on the convoy did not make it this far. She was very much a survivor in the sense that she was going to be determined to survive. She just powered on. She had the goal in her head, and she just went. She just walked. And so she bartered with these officers, and she was like, listen, I am a member of the Luftwaffe. My husband was in the army for years. You need to get me on this train. I need to go to Berlin. And all of these trains were heading to Berlin. All of them, train after train as they were coming, were filled with wounded soldiers. Until finally, of course, because she is so persuasive, or maybe because she was so annoying, one of them looked at her and they said, okay, we'll put you on this next train if you act as a nurse on the train. And she said, perfect, I can be a nurse. So they open up the train door, and it's filled with Hitler Youth. This is like a cattle car. It's nothing like a train car. No seats. It's littered with young boys that are 12 to 14 years old. She puts her daughter down in the corner with a boy who didn't look too injured, but mainly shell-shocked. And she waited for them to get her supplies, but she had no supplies. They were all bleeding, crying, hungry, and they just shut the door and they let the train continue on. So she picked up one boy who was crying, and she was crying for his mother. Mama, mama. And then so she picked him up and he put her in her arms. And he looked at her and continued to call her mama. And she said as she held him, she could feel him leaving. And she felt him leave his body and die. You can imagine after 4 days of walking in the frigid cold and finally getting to this place of surroundings of death, that you can't blame her for turning it off. She kind of went numb, and it's a long, long journey from that train to Berlin, of which she can't really recall much of what happened past that encounter with the young boy who died in her arms. But finally she got to Berlin. The young boy who was holding her daughter was severely frozen. Her feet were permanently damaged. And she spent the remainder of the war in Berlin. She didn't go back to the Luftwaffe. And none of this was because she gave up on the cause or whatever that meant to be a Nazi. It was, she had just experienced enough to survive. And that was her goal. In the end of her days, it was actually my grandma's feet that did her in the end. She lived till 92 years old, until she got an infection in her foot and passed away from that. I almost found it kind of ironic that the thing that eventually did my heroic grandma in was the feat that got her to safety in the first place. She believed that being that surrounded in death and feeling death and breathing death around her for that long train ride to Berlin and that long 4-day walk of the blizzard of hell through Germany, through the German plains, and in the convoy of cars, and even in her indirect way of how she herself was responsible for multiple deaths in her involvement with the Luftwaffe. She felt almost cursed by a lot of the spirits that had surrounded her. And so my grandma, through the rest of her life, kind of claimed that she had this ability to speak to the dead or communicate with the dead. On multiple occasions, she could see or experience ghosts. She believed she had apparitions that could tell her things, that she could predict when bad things were going to happen. And sometimes it scared me, but it couldn't even compare to the haunting that she felt. I'd like to conclude by saying that this story is not particularly a unique story. Many people who have family that had lived through World War II and World War I have similar stories to these. And those are great and unique, and they are your family treasures. Because my grandmother is a Nazi does not make her story less sympathetic, less human, or less raw. I tell my students this story because it is so important that they understand that what you can clearly detail as your enemy is not always the case. If only it were so simple.
if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessarily only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? I certainly do not lack sympathy or remorse for my grandmother, and sadly, one of my deepest regrets in life is that while I was a child, I didn't have a lot of sympathy for her. I knew what a Nazi was. I knew through my Polish heritage what a Nazi was. I denied relationship and closeness with her for many of my young life. And I felt that there was no forgiveness for that. And I feel in my heart I was quite cruel to her. She was never cruel to me, however. She was a lovely person. She was so warm, and as my mother really pointed out at her funeral, that she was one of the warmest mother-in-laws you could ever want. She was never critical or judgmental of my mom, who was an incredibly sweet, lovely person. But she always referred to her as her angel. She always referred to me as the little one, and always knew my special needs that I always needed. Like, she knew and understood my artistic abilities and my creativity and wanted to nurture that. And unfortunately, I did not accept a lot of her I didn't accept a lot of who she was because of this title that had befallen on her. That she was a member of the Luftwaffe and that she was a Nazi. Sometimes it would be the running joke in our family. And it's not that it was anything to be proud of, but it was the fact that she was not inhuman. She was very human. And your enemy is exactly that. I think this line that we divide sometimes in postmodernism of who your enemies are, or what social justice looks like, or what the solution is so much more complicated than just saying, there it is. It takes a deeply examined life, and I think it takes a deeply examined individual. Each case is different. And I will say, till the end of my days, she was a member of the Nazi Party, and she was a very good person. And her story not only commands respect and admiration for her as a strong, independent woman who did this by herself with a 3-year-old daughter, but also one who was not shied away from death, who was empowered by it and affected by it in miraculous ways till the remainder of her days. And that's the story that I tell to my students.